There are moments in life that split everything in two, before and after. The kind of moment where you're standing in one world 1 second, and the next second, that world is completely gone. For me, that moment came on a Tuesday morning in April. I was sitting in a gray plastic chair in a courthouse hallway, wearing the only black blazer I owned, holding a manila folder so tightly that my knuckles had gone pale. My hands wouldn't stop shaking. Not from fear, not even from grief, though I had plenty of that. No. My hands were shaking because for the first time in 2 years of being lied to, manipulated, and pushed to the edge of everything I had, I finally had proof. And so did the court. My name is Clara. I'm 41 years old. I grew up in a small house with a big family and even bigger secrets. My father, Raymond, was a quiet man who believed in hard work, fairness, and putting family first. He spent 37 years building a modest but meaningful life, a house, some land, a small business that he ran out of his garage for most of his adult life. He wasn't wealthy by anyone's standards, but what he had, he built with his hands. And he always said, always, that it would be shared equally between his children when he was gone. He had 2 children, me, and my brother Dennis. And that's where the story gets complicated. Because by the time my father passed away, 2 years ago this spring, Dennis had already decided that equally wasn't a word that applied to him. He had already made other plans. Plans that involved a pen, a piece of paper, and a signature that was not my father's. But here's the thing about forgery. Here's the thing about lies that are built on top of other lies, stacked so carefully that they almost look real. They crack. Always. Eventually. They crack. And on that Tuesday morning in April, sitting in that courthouse hallway, with that folder in my trembling hands, everything was about to crack wide open. This is the story of how my brother forged my father's will, how he almost got away with it, and how the one person who could have saved him from himself was already sitting in that courtroom, waiting. Stay with me. Because this story is going to take you somewhere you won't expect. To understand what happened, you have to understand who my father was, and who my brother and I were inside his house. Raymond Cole was not an easy man to love. He was distant in the way that men of his generation were often distant. Not cold exactly, but reserved. He showed love through action, not words. He fixed your bike without being asked. He sat quietly in the back row at your school play. He put money in an envelope and slid it under your door when he knew you were struggling. He never said, "I love you" easily, but you felt it. In the way he looked at you, in the way he stayed. He worked as an electrician for most of his life, and later ran a small electrical supplies business from a converted garage behind our house. It was never glamorous, but it was his. He was proud of it in the way that people who built things from nothing tend to be proud, quietly, deeply, without needing anyone else to see it. My mother passed when Dennis and I were young. I was 11, Dennis was 8. After that, it was just the 3 of us. And I want to be honest with you, those years were hard. My father did his best, but grief changes people. It made him quieter, more inward. And somewhere in those years after Mom left, Dennis and I started growing in very different directions. I was the one who stayed close. I helped around the house, learned to cook, sat with my father in the evenings when he didn't want to talk, but didn't want to be alone either. I got good grades, went to a nearby college, came back home after graduation, and eventually took a job in the city about 40 minutes away. I visited every weekend. I checked in every few days. When Dad got older and his health started slipping, I was the one managing his appointments, picking up his prescriptions, sitting in waiting rooms while doctors used words like early stage and we'll monitor it. Dennis was different. Dennis was always the one with bigger plans, bigger ideas. He moved to another city in his 20s, chased a series of businesses that never quite worked out, and called home less and less as the years went on. He had a charm to him. I want to be fair, he was genuinely magnetic when he wanted to be. But there was always something underneath the charm, that felt slightly off, slightly too eager, like he was always calculating, always measuring what something was worth to him before he decided how much to give. He and my father had a complicated relationship. My father loved him. I never doubted that. But there was tension there too, disappointment that went unspoken. Dennis had borrowed money from Dad more than once over the years. For a restaurant that failed, for a real estate deal that collapsed, for things I'm not even sure I knew the full story of. And each time, Dad gave it, because he was that kind of man. What I didn't know, what I wouldn't discover until much later, was that Dennis had kept a careful count of all of it, that beneath the surface of his casual, breezy phone calls home, he was watching, calculating, waiting. He was waiting for the moment our father would stop being a source of money while he was alive, and start being a source of money after he was gone. My father was diagnosed with early-stage Parkinson's disease when he was 72. The doctors were cautiously optimistic at first. With proper care, proper medication, proper management, he could live comfortably for years. And he did. For about 2 years, you almost wouldn't have noticed. He moved a little slower. His handwriting got shakier. He tired more easily. But he was still himself, still sharp, still Raymond. Then in his 74th year, things started to shift. The tremors got worse. His balance became unreliable. He had a fall in the kitchen one February morning. Nothing broken, just badly shaken. And after that, he was different. More careful, more aware of his own fragility. And for the first time in my life, I watched my father become afraid. That was the year I started spending more time at the house. I reduced my hours at work. I rearranged my life around his needs. It was not a sacrifice I resented. I want to make that clear. I did it because I loved him and because it was right. But it did mean I was there for all of it. The difficult doctor visits, the conversations about the future, the evenings when he sat in his armchair and stared at nothing for a long time. It was also the year Dennis suddenly reappeared. I say suddenly because that's exactly what it was. After nearly 3 years of sparse contact, occasional calls, 2 brief visits, a handful of texts, Dennis arrived one Thursday afternoon with a suitcase and a wide smile and a story about how he'd been going through some changes and wanted to spend more time with family. My father was delighted. I could see it in his face, the way he lit up when Dennis walked through the door, the way his whole body relaxed. He had missed his son. Whatever distance had grown between them, whatever disappointments had settled in the gaps, none of that mattered in that moment. His boy was home. I told myself to be glad. I told myself this was good. Dad needed support, and if Dennis was going to step up, then I should welcome that. But something felt off. I couldn't put words to it immediately. It was just a feeling, a low, persistent hum of unease that I couldn't shake no matter how much I tried to reason it away. Dennis stayed. At first he said it was temporary. Then a week became 2 weeks. 2 weeks became a month. He settled into my father's spare room and fell into a routine of sorts. He made breakfast. He drove Dad to some of his appointments. He watched television with him in the evenings. On the surface, it looked like a devoted son caring for an aging parent. But I noticed things. I noticed that Dennis was always in the room when Dad was on the phone with his attorney. I noticed that he started asking questions about the business, about its value, about who owned the building, about whether Dad had any outstanding debts. I noticed that when I came to visit and tried to speak to Dad alone, Dennis had a habit of wandering in after a few minutes, casually, naturally, as if he just happened to be passing. I noticed that my father, who had always been sharp about financial matters, seemed less certain in conversations now, more hesitant, more deferential to Dennis's opinions. And I noticed that Dennis had started referring to "when the house becomes mine" in conversations. Just once, quietly, to me, with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. I told myself I was being paranoid. I told myself I was exhausted and that grief was making me see shadows everywhere. I told myself that my brother was not capable of what my instincts were telling me he was building toward. I was wrong. My father died on a Thursday morning in March, 18 months after Dennis came back. He passed quietly, in his own bed, with both of us in the house. The hospice nurse said it was peaceful. I held his hand. I don't remember much else from that morning. Grief has a way of making time go strange, blurring some moments and sharpening others until you're not sure what was real and what your mind filled in later. The week that followed was a gray blur. Arrangements, phone calls, a small service at the church he'd attended for 40 years, people coming and going, bringing food, saying words that I heard but couldn't quite absorb. Through all of it, Dennis was efficient, organized. He handled things I would have struggled to manage in my state of shock, and for that I was, briefly, grateful. Then, 2 weeks after the funeral, Dennis called me to the house for what he said was a conversation about next steps. I drove over on a Sunday afternoon expecting paperwork, expecting a straightforward discussion about dividing the estate, about the business, about the house. I had spoken to my father about his wishes many times over the years. I knew what they were. The house was to be sold and the proceeds split equally. The business was to be offered first to his longtime employee Marcus, and whatever Marcus couldn't buy would be liquidated and split equally. Simple, fair. Raymond. I sat down at the kitchen table. Dennis sat across from me, and he slid a document across the table. Dad updated his will, he said, about 6 months ago. I looked at the document. It was several pages, printed, with what appeared to be my father's signature on the final page. I read it slowly. Then I read it again. Under this document, Dennis was to receive the house, outright, in full, with no requirement to sell or split. The business, including all assets and the building it operated from, also went entirely to Dennis. I received what the document called personal effects and sentimental items, essentially, whatever physical objects I chose to take from the house. Nothing else. I looked up at my brother. He was watching me with that same smile, the one that didn't reach his eyes. I know it's a lot to take in, he said. I asked him when Dad had changed the will. He said 6 months ago, just as he'd said. I asked why I'd never been told. He said Dad had wanted to wait until the right time. I asked why it was so different from everything Dad had always told me his wishes were. And Dennis, and I will never forget this, leaned back in his chair, crossed his arms, and said, "People change their minds, Clara, especially at the end." Something cold moved through me in that moment. Not anger, not yet. Something quieter and more dangerous than anger. Disbelief. Because I had been there. I had been there through every difficult conversation, every doctor's visit, every frightened night. I had read the documents my father kept in his filing cabinet, including the will he had shown me himself, 2 years prior, which said exactly what he had always said it would say. And the signature on the document Dennis had just handed me, my father's signature, the one I had watched form on 1,000 birthday cards and permission slips and Christmas letters, did not look right. It was close. It was very close. But it wasn't right. I took the document home. I didn't say a word. That night I couldn't sleep. I sat at my kitchen table with the document Dennis had given me and a cup of tea that went cold before I touched it, and I read every word 3 times. The language was formal, legal sounding. It referenced the correct names, the correct property addresses, the correct details of the business. Whoever had prepared it had done their research. It wasn't the work of an amateur, but it had a quality to it, a smoothness, an almost rightness, that felt constructed rather than lived, like a forgery of a painting, technically accurate but emotionally hollow. And the signature. The more I looked at it, the more certain I became that something was wrong. My father's handwriting had changed in his final years. The Parkinson's had affected his fine motor control, and his signature had become shakier, more effortful. But it had changed in a very specific way that anyone who knew his handwriting would recognize. The tremor was consistent. The letter forms were still his, compressed, slightly slanted to the right, the capital R in Raymond done in one connected motion that he'd used for 70 years. The signature on this document was shaky, but it was shaky in the wrong way, hesitant in the wrong places. The R was drawn in 2 strokes instead of 1. The tremor was there, but it felt performed rather than natural, like someone had studied a shaky signature and reproduced the idea of shakiness without understanding its specific character. I'm not a handwriting expert. I want to be clear about that. I had no formal training, no credentials, no standing to make a professional judgment. But I was his daughter. I had seen that signature my entire life. I went to my own filing cabinet and pulled out a folder of documents I had kept from my father's house, copies of paperwork I'd helped him manage over the years, old tax returns, a letter from his attorney, and his will, the one he had shown me himself 2 years before his death, printed and signed and notarized, with a copy that he had handed to me and said, "So you know it's done right." I placed the 2 documents side by side. The difference was subtle, but it was there. I didn't sleep that night. The next morning I called an attorney. Not the same attorney who had apparently overseen the new will, who turned out to be someone I had never heard of, a name that didn't come up in any of the previous paperwork my father had ever dealt with. I called a different attorney, a woman named Patricia Donahue, who had been recommended to me by a colleague a few years prior, and whose name I had saved in my phone for reasons I couldn't have articulated at the time. I told her what had happened. I sent her photographs of both documents. She was quiet for a long time after she looked at them. Then she said, "I want you to come in tomorrow, and I want you to bring every piece of your father's handwriting you can find." I spent that afternoon gathering everything: letters, cards, signed receipts from the business, a handwritten grocery list I found tucked inside an old cookbook, a birthday card he'd sent me 3 years ago, a note he'd written me the Christmas before he got truly ill, folded and kept in my bedside drawer. I put it all in a folder, and I drove to Patricia's office the next morning with the particular clarity that comes when you've stopped being sad and started being determined. Patricia Donahue was a small woman in her late 50s, with reading glasses she wore on a chain and a way of speaking that made you feel like every word she said had been chosen carefully and meant exactly what it sounded like. She was the opposite of flashy. She was the kind of attorney who won cases not by being louder than everyone else, but by being more prepared. She spread the documents across her desk, laid my father's letters and cards beside them, and studied everything for a long time without speaking. I had learned, in that first meeting, not to interrupt her silences. Finally, she looked up. "The signature on the new will is problematic," she said. "I'm not prepared to say definitively. That's a job for a forensic document examiner. But I can tell you that the inconsistencies you noticed are real, and that any competent examiner is going to notice them too. That's the first issue." "What are the others?" I asked. She pointed to the notarization stamp at the bottom of the document. "This notary. Do you know who this is?" I shook my head. "Because your father's previous will, the one you've shown me, was notarized by a notary he'd used for years. A man named Gerald Huff, who has a practice in the town where your father lived, and who apparently handled all of Raymond's legal documents for over a decade. This new will was notarized by someone else, someone with a practice 40 minutes away in a different county." I let that settle. "There are also," Patricia continued, "some procedural questions. A will of this nature, one that represents a significant departure from the deceased's previous stated wishes, should ideally have documentation of the process. A record of the attorney's consultations with your father, notes about your father's mental state and competency at the time of signing, given his health condition. We can request those records." "And if they don't exist?" She looked at me over her glasses. "Then that becomes very important information." Over the next 6 weeks, Patricia moved methodically. She requested the records from the attorney who had allegedly drafted the new will, a man named Thomas Greer, who operated a small solo practice, and who, it turned out, had met with my father exactly once. One meeting, for a will that completely overturned the previous document. with no documented assessment of competency, despite a Parkinson's diagnosis that was on record with my father's regular physician. She hired a forensic document examiner, a woman named Dr. Elaine Marsh, who had testified as an expert witness in court proceedings more than 60 times. Dr. Marsh spent 2 weeks analyzing the signature on the new will alongside 43 samples of my father's authentic handwriting. Her conclusion, delivered in a 14-page report, was unambiguous. The signature on the new will was, with a high degree of probability, not written by Raymond Cole. The tremor pattern was inconsistent with his documented condition. The letter-form construction did not match his established habits. And there was one specific characteristic: the way my father's hand always lifted slightly before completing the final letter of his name, that was completely absent from the signature on the new will. Patricia filed a petition to contest the will on the grounds of fraud, forgery, and undue influence. And then things got very interesting, because when Dennis received notice of the challenge, he didn't panic. He didn't retreat. He doubled down. He hired an attorney of his own, an aggressive one, and declared publicly, to anyone who would listen, that I was a bitter, jealous sister who couldn't accept that our father had made his final wishes clear. He sent me a text message that I have saved to this day. It said, "You're embarrassing yourself. Everyone who knew Dad knows he wanted this. You're just angry because he finally saw through you." I read that message and I thought about my father, quiet, fair, careful Raymond. And I thought about the birthday card in my bedside drawer and the handwritten grocery list I'd found in the cookbook. And I put my phone down and went back to work. Because I wasn't embarrassed. I was ready. There is a piece of this story that I haven't told you yet. A piece that changes everything. And I've been building toward it because it didn't come to me all at once. It arrived the way important things often arrive, quietly, through a side door, when I had almost stopped expecting it. About 3 weeks after Patricia filed the contest petition, I received a phone call from a woman named Eloise Chambers. I didn't recognize the name. She explained that she was the notary whose stamp appeared on my father's new will, the one who operated 40 minutes away in another county. My first instinct was caution. I told her I was in active legal proceedings and that she should speak to my attorney. She said she already had. She'd called Patricia's office that morning, and Patricia had given her my number. That told me something important. Patricia had already spoken with her, and Patricia had decided I should hear this directly. Eloise Chambers was 63 years old and had been a notary for over 20 years. She told me that on the date in question, the date that appeared on my father's new will as the date of signing, she had received a call from a man who identified himself as Dennis Cole. He told her that his elderly father needed a document notarized at home, that the father had limited mobility and couldn't come to an office, and that the matter was urgent as the father was in poor health. She had agreed to make a house call. This was unusual for her, but not unheard of. She had done it for elderly clients before. She drove to my father's house on a Wednesday afternoon. She was met at the door by Dennis. She was shown into the living room, where an elderly man was seated in an armchair. Dennis told her his father's name was Raymond, and that he needed to witness and notarize the man's signature on a document. She noted, and this is the part that had haunted her since she first heard about the legal challenge, that the elderly man said very little during the process. He seemed, in her words, confused and tired. When she explained the document to him, as was her professional obligation, he nodded slowly, but did not respond with any specific acknowledgement of its contents. When she asked him if he understood what he was signing, Dennis answered before Raymond could. She asked again, directly to Raymond. He said yes. She had no basis at the time to refuse. He signed. She stamped. She left. But here is what Eloise Chambers did not know at the time. What she only discovered later, after the legal challenge was filed, and she had been contacted by a county records office checking the validity of a notarized document. The address she had been taken to that Wednesday afternoon was not my father's house. It was a rental property Dennis had access to, a house in the same general area, similar in appearance, but a different address entirely. My father, on that Wednesday afternoon, had been at a medical appointment 40 minutes away, an appointment that was on record, signed in, documented. He had been accompanied by his regular home health aide, a woman named Sylvia, who had documented the visit in her daily care log as she always did. Raymond Cole had not been in that living room. The man who had signed was not my father. And Eloise Chambers, 63 years old, professional, meticulous, and now deeply shaken, had already filed a formal complaint with the state notary board, and she had agreed to testify. I sat with that information for a long time after Patricia told me. I thought about the level of planning it had taken, the staging. Whoever had sat in that armchair, I don't know who it was, and we may never fully know, had been convincing enough that a professional notary hadn't questioned it. Dennis had chosen someone physically similar to my father, had prepared the setting, had coached the performance, the depth of it, the coldness of it. I had grown up with this person, shared a childhood with him, eaten dinner with him at my father's table for years. And I realized, sitting in Patricia's office listening to all of this, that I had never really known him at all. The hearing was scheduled for a Tuesday in April, a probate court proceeding to determine the validity of the contested will. I want to tell you about the morning of, because I think it captures something important about what this kind of experience does to a person, what it feels like to be inside a legal fight over your father's legacy while still carrying the weight of losing him. I woke at 5 in the morning. I hadn't slept well, maybe 3 hours, broken into pieces. I lay in the dark for a while, listening to the silence, and I thought about my father. Not about the case, not about Dennis, just about Raymond. I thought about the evenings I'd spent sitting across from him while he watched the evening news, not talking, just being in the same room. I thought about the way he smelled, aftershave and engine oil, and something specific to him that I couldn't name but would know anywhere. I thought about the last real conversation we had, about 2 weeks before he lost the ability to have long conversations, where he told me that the thing he was most proud of in his life was that he had tried to be fair. "I always tried to be fair, Clara," he said. "I know I wasn't always perfect, but I tried." I thought about that, and then I got up, made coffee, put on my black blazer, and drove to the courthouse. Patricia met me in the hallway 20 minutes before the scheduled start. She was carrying a briefcase that looked like it was about to split its seams, and she had the particular expression she wore when she had prepared more thoroughly than the situation required, which, I had learned, was her normal state. She told me what to expect. The proceeding would begin with the judge reviewing the documentation. Dr. Marsh would testify as our expert witness. Eloise Chambers would testify. Dennis's attorney would challenge and cross-examine. There might be a recess. The judge would likely not rule immediately. These things often required additional review time. I told her I understood. What she said next, she said quietly, almost as an aside. "There is something I want you to be prepared for. When I filed the discovery request last week, the requests for any documentation related to the preparation of the contested will, I received something this morning that I haven't had time to fully review. It was in the supplementary documents from the attorney Greer." "What is it?" I asked. "A notarization log," she said. "Standard practice. Every notary keeps a record of every document they notarize. Address, date, names of parties present." "Eloise Chambers' log?" "No," Patricia said. "This is from Greer's records. His office worked with a notary, not Eloise Chambers, a different one, to notarize some preliminary documents related to the will preparation. Standard stuff, nothing unusual. But the log also contains an entry I wasn't expecting." She paused. "There's a second notary listed for a document dated 3 months before the will was allegedly signed, and that notary's name is Gerald Huff." I stared at her. "That's my father's regular notary, the one he'd used for 30 years. "Yes," Patricia said, "which means at some point during this process, Gerald Huff was involved. And I have been trying to reach him since this morning, and I just received a call back 20 minutes ago." She looked at me with an expression I hadn't seen on her face before, something between professional composure and barely contained urgency. "Gerald Huff is here," she said. "He's in the building. He came of his own accord this morning when he saw the case listed in the court calendar. He has something with him. A document your father brought to him 3 months before the new will was supposedly signed." "What kind of document?" "A signed, notarized statement," Patricia said, "in which your father specifically states that he has not authorized any changes to his existing will, and that any document purporting to represent a new will should be considered fraudulent." The hallway was quiet. I could hear footsteps somewhere down the corridor, the distant sound of a door closing. "He knew," I said. It wasn't a question. "He knew something," Patricia said carefully. "He may not have known the full extent of it, but he knew enough to protect himself, and he trusted the right person with it." I looked down at the folder in my hands. My knuckles were pale. "Gerald Huff is already inside the courtroom," Patricia said. "He came early. He's been sitting there for 40 minutes. I closed my eyes for one breath. Then I straightened my shoulders, picked up my folder, and walked toward the courtroom doors. Courtrooms in probate proceedings are quieter than the ones you see in films. There's no jury, no packed gallery, just a room with wooden benches, fluorescent lighting, and the particular weight of formal proceedings pressing down on everything. I walked in and found a seat on the left side. Patricia set her briefcase on the table and began arranging her documents. Across the room, Dennis was seated with his attorney, a heavy-set man named Caldwell, who had the manner of someone perpetually mildly irritated by the situation around him. Dennis was wearing a suit I didn't recognize. He looked composed, almost bored. He glanced at me when I came in. Our eyes met for a moment. He looked away first. On the far bench, near the back of the room, sat an older man in a gray cardigan with a leather document case across his knees. Gerald Huff. I recognized him from the few times I'd seen him at my father's house over the years. A careful, deliberate man with thick glasses and the steady manner of someone who takes his responsibilities seriously. He caught my eye when I sat down and gave me a small nod. I nodded back. The judge entered at 9:15. The Honorable Margaret Lowe, a woman in her mid-60s who moved through the room with the efficiency of someone who had no interest in drama, only in resolution. The proceedings began with a summary of the petition. Patricia laid out the grounds for contest methodically and without embellishment. The anomalies in the signature, the questionable circumstances of the signing, the inconsistencies with the deceased's known and documented wishes. Dennis's attorney Caldwell began his response with what I recognized as his central strategy, discrediting me. He described me as a disgruntled beneficiary unable to accept the legitimately expressed final wishes of her father. He suggested that my grief had led to paranoid conclusions and that I had weaponized legal proceedings to delay the inevitable. I sat still and looked at the table and thought about my father's grocery list, the one in his real handwriting, the one that was sitting in my folder. Then Patricia called Dr. Elaine Marsh. Dr. Marsh was exactly what you want an expert witness to be: composed, precise, and impossible to rattle. She walked through her analysis of the signature with the calm certainty of someone describing facts rather than opinions. She displayed enlarged comparison images on a screen at the front of the room. She explained the specific characteristics she had identified: the tremor pattern inconsistencies, the letter form constructions, the lifting characteristic my father had always shown, and that was entirely absent from the contested signature. Caldwell cross-examined aggressively. Dr. Marsh did not waver. Then Patricia called Eloise Chambers. Eloise was visibly nervous. The notary board complaint had shaken her, and the weight of what she had unknowingly participated in was something she had been carrying for weeks. But she told her story clearly. The phone call from Dennis, the house call, the elderly man in the armchair, the way Dennis had answered questions on the man's behalf, the way she had been too inexperienced in the specific red flags of elder fraud to recognize what was happening. And then the crucial piece, what she had discovered afterward. The address discrepancy. My father's verified medical appointment that day, documented in two separate records. The fact that the man she had notarized a signature for had not been Raymond Cole. Caldwell objected, challenged, pressed. Eloise held. Dennis, at the table across the room, had stopped looking bored, and then the judge called a brief recess. During the recess, Patricia spoke quietly with Gerald Huff. I sat at our table and breathed. I didn't look at Dennis. I could feel him looking at me. When the session resumed, Patricia stood and said she had one additional witness not previously listed, a matter that had come to her attention only that morning through discovery documents. She requested permission to call Gerald Huff. Caldwell objected strenuously. There was an extended back and forth. Judge Lowe considered it with her characteristic economy of expression, and then she said, "Given the nature of the document Mr. Huff is prepared to introduce and its direct relevance to the question of the deceased's authentic intentions, I will allow it." Gerald Huff walked to the front of the room with his leather document case and settled himself in the witness chair like a man who had testified before and knew what was expected of him. Patricia asked him to explain his relationship with Raymond Cole. He said he had been my father's notary for 31 years, that my father had come to him with every significant document he had ever signed, that they had, over the decades, developed a relationship that, while professional, was also built on a degree of personal trust. Then Patricia asked him about the document in his case. Gerald Huff opened the case and withdrew a single page, crisp and carefully preserved. He described it, a statement, drafted and signed by Raymond Cole, in his own hand, notarized by Gerald Huff himself, dated 3 months and 11 days before the contested will. In the statement, my father wrote, in his own words, in his own unsteady but unmistakable handwriting, that he was aware that his son Dennis had been making inquiries about the value of his estate and about the terms of his existing will, that he was aware Dennis had suggested on multiple occasions that the will should be changed in Dennis's favor, that he, Raymond Cole, had not authorized any such changes, and that in the event any document appeared after his death purporting to represent a new or revised will, that document should be treated with serious suspicion. He had written it himself, had it notarized, had given it to the one man he trusted most with important papers. He had known. The courtroom was very quiet. I looked at Dennis for the first time since the session had resumed. His face had gone the color of old paper. His attorney was leaning toward him, speaking quickly and quietly. Dennis wasn't listening. He was looking at the document in Gerald Huff's hands with an expression I had never seen on my brother's face before. It was the expression of a man watching something that he thought was finished opening its eyes. Judge Lowe did not rule immediately. She was not a woman who rushed conclusions. She called a recess and asked for several documents to be formally entered into the record. She asked Caldwell if he had any additional witnesses or evidence to present on Dennis's behalf. He asked for time to consult with his client. She gave him 20 minutes. I sat in the hallway on the gray plastic chairs and held my folder and thought about nothing in particular. Patricia sat beside me and worked through something on her phone. Gerald Huff came and sat a few seats away and said nothing, which I was grateful for. Eloise Chambers had left the building. She had testified. She had said what needed to be said, and I think the experience had exhausted her. I hoped eventually she would find some peace in the fact that she had done the right thing when she understood what had happened. When we went back in, Caldwell had a different quality to him. The irritation was gone. He was just tired. He said, on behalf of his client, that Dennis wished to withdraw his claim to the contested will and did not intend to present further evidence or witnesses. The room absorbed that in silence. Judge Lowe looked at Caldwell for a moment. Then she said that given the evidence presented and the withdrawal of the primary defense, she was prepared to rule on the validity of the contested will. She found it invalid on the grounds of fraud and forgery. The existing will, my father's real will, the one he had signed and notarized with Gerald Huff years before, was confirmed as the controlling document. She also noted, and she said this with the particular clarity of someone speaking for the record, that the evidence presented raised serious questions of criminal conduct, and that she was referring the matter to the district attorney's office for further review. Then she closed her folder and left the bench. I don't remember the next few minutes clearly. I remember Patricia's hand on my arm. I remember the sound of Dennis's chair scraping back and his footsteps crossing the room. I remember, and this is the part I will remember for the rest of my life, looking up as he passed our table. He stopped. For just a second, he stopped and looked at me. I don't know what he was looking for. Maybe an opening. Maybe forgiveness. Maybe something he couldn't even name. I looked back at him and thought about all the years, the childhood we had shared, the father who had loved us both, the man who had sat down and written that statement with his shaking hands and carried it to Gerald Huff and done the last careful, fair thing he could do to protect what he'd built. I didn't say anything to Dennis. There was nothing to say that the morning hadn't already said better. He walked out. I sat in that courtroom for a while longer after everyone else had gone, just sitting, just breathing. The fluorescent lights hummed. Someone in another part of the building was talking on a phone. I could hear the voice, but not the words, just the rhythm of it. Eventually, I stood up, picked up my folder, and walked out into the April afternoon. The sun was doing something complicated with the clouds. I sat in my car in the parking lot for a long time, and then I called the one person I always called when something important happened, except I couldn't, because Raymond was gone. So instead, I sat in the parking lot and talked to him anyway. Out loud, in the empty car, the way you do when the grief and the relief arrive at the same moment, and there's no distinction between them anymore. I told him about Gerald Huff, sitting at the back of the courtroom in his gray cardigan. I told him about the judge's face when she read his statement. I told him that it had worked, that he had been heard. I told him I was sorry I hadn't seen it sooner. And I told him that he had been right. About everything. About trying to be fair. The months that followed were complicated in the way that legal and family situations always are after a crisis. Not cleanly resolved, but slowly settling, like sediment after a disturbance in water. The district attorney's office opened an investigation. I cooperated fully, providing all documentation, all correspondence, all of it. Dennis was eventually charged with fraud, forgery of a legal document, and elder financial exploitation. I won't detail the full proceedings here. They stretched over a year, involved their own hearings and their own difficult testimony, and the experience of watching your brother sit across a courtroom while a prosecutor reads charges against him is not one I have the words for yet. He reached a plea agreement. He did not go to prison, though he came close. He received a suspended sentence, probation, significant financial penalties, and a civil judgment that required him to repay the legal costs I had incurred, which were substantial. He also lost his business license in the state, which effectively ended the various ventures he had been pursuing. I do not know where he lives now. We have not spoken. The estate was settled according to my father's real will. The house was sold. The business was offered to Marcus, my father's longtime employee, a good man who had worked beside Raymond for nearly 2 decades, and Marcus was able to purchase it with the help of a small business loan. He's still running it. I drove past it once, a few months after the sale. There was a new sign above the garage. Same business, different name. Marcus had asked me if I minded that he'd changed it, and I had told him that my father would have been pleased. What else? I still have the birthday card from my father's bedside drawer. I still have the grocery list from the cookbook. I keep them in a folder with Gerald Huff's notarized statement, not because I need to look at them often, but because they represent something I want to hold on to. The idea that even at the end, even when everything was uncertain, my father acted with clarity and care and fairness. He couldn't prevent what Dennis tried to do, but he prepared for it. He documented it. He trusted the right person. And Eloise Chambers, the notary who had unknowingly participated, sent me a letter 6 months after the hearing. She thanked me for not blaming her publicly and for what she called my graciousness. I want to be honest. Graciousness wasn't exactly what I felt toward her in those first weeks. But she hadn't known. She had made an error of judgment in agreeing to a house call, but she had not been malicious. And when she understood what had happened, she had done everything right. She had come forward. She had testified. She had filed the complaint. There is something important in that. It would have been easier for her to stay quiet, to tell herself she hadn't been sure, that it wasn't her problem, that the whole thing was somebody else's mess. She chose differently, and that choice was not small. Gerald Huff retired the following spring. I went to his retirement gathering, a modest event at a local restaurant, and when I shook his hand, I thanked him for what he'd done. He waved it away in the manner of a man who considers doing the right thing self-evident and therefore not requiring thanks. But then he said something I have thought about many times since. He said, "Your father knew you'd find it. He always spoke about you with a particular kind of confidence. He knew you'd look in the right places." I didn't know what to say to that. I just held his hand for a moment, and then I let go. I've spent a long time thinking about what this story means, what lesson lives inside it, because there are several, depending on where you stand and what you bring to it. There is the obvious lesson about greed, about how the hunger for more than we're entitled to can hollow a person out from the inside, can lead them to do things that would have seemed impossible to an earlier version of themselves. Dennis didn't start life as someone who would do what he did. He started as a little boy in the same house I grew up in, eating breakfast at the same table, watching the same father move through the same rooms. Something happened to him over the years. I don't fully understand what. I'm not sure I want to. But I know that whatever it was, it operated slowly, incrementally, until the person he became had almost no resemblance to the person he had been. There is the lesson about documentation, about the quiet, unglamorous power of writing things down. My father was not a dramatic man. He didn't confront Dennis directly. Perhaps he couldn't. Perhaps he was too ill. Perhaps he simply didn't want the confrontation in whatever time he had left. But he acted. Carefully, privately, practically. He sat down and wrote the truth and gave it to someone he trusted. That piece of paper, that single notarized statement, saved everything. It was the most Raymond thing he could possibly have done. There's the lesson about instinct, about the importance of that low, persistent hum of unease that you sometimes feel when something is wrong and you can't yet name it. I almost talked myself out of what I was feeling in those early days. I almost convinced myself I was paranoid, exhausted, grief-stricken to the point of irrationality. And I was all of those things. But I was also right. Instinct is not infallible. I know that. But it is worth listening to, especially when it concerns the people closest to you. And there is the lesson that I find the most difficult to sit with even now. The one about love and what it cannot protect you from. I loved my brother. I want to say that clearly. Whatever he became, whatever he did, I spent a childhood with him. We shared a loss, our mother, that marked us both in ways neither of us fully understood. I don't think love requires you to forgive everything or to maintain contact with someone who has done what Dennis did. But I also think it's dishonest to pretend the love wasn't there. It's easier, in a way, to simply declare someone a villain and be done with it. Reality is messier. People who hurt us are often also people we once knew in other contexts, other capacities, other times. My father knew this. I think it's part of why he didn't confront Dennis directly. Because even at the end, sick and tired and aware of what his son was planning, he still couldn't entirely reduce him to the thing he was doing. He documented the truth, protected what he'd built, and then left it in the hands of other people to resolve. That is perhaps the most heartbreaking piece of all of it. That my father spent some portion of his final months knowing this was coming, preparing for it quietly, doing what he could. And also, and I believe this with everything I have, still hoping he was wrong. He wasn't. But he had tried. To be fair. To do right. To leave something worth leaving. And in the end, that is what survived. Not the forged signature, not the staged house, not the borrowed authority of a stranger in an armchair. Just my father, trying to be fair, just the truth, written in a shaking hand, placed in a leather case, carried into a courthouse on a Tuesday morning in April by a man in a gray cardigan who had known Raymond Cole for 31 years. Just that. And it was enough. If you're watching this, and you're in the middle of something that feels impossible, a betrayal, a family dispute, a moment where the lies seem bigger and louder and more powerful than anything you have, I want to tell you what I've learned. Document everything. Trust your instincts. Find the right people and trust them fully. And be patient. Not passive. There is a difference. Be patient with the process while being relentless in your pursuit of what is true. The truth has weight. It settles. Everything else, the forgeries, the performances, the carefully staged rooms, eventually falls away. And the notary who should never have been there is already sitting in the courtroom, waiting. Thank you for watching. If this story moved you, if it reminded you of something you've lived or someone you love, share it. Leave a comment. Tell me your story. Because sometimes the most powerful thing is just knowing that someone else has been in the gray hallway, has held the folder with shaking hands, has walked through those doors anyway. Take care of yourselves, and take care of each other.